We have a great guest today. I'm so excited to be here with you. I wanted to welcome you to the Best Places to Lead show. I am your host, Jerry McNamara, and I'm grateful you're here or that you decided to press play and listen to us. So we're on a mission to positively impact 5 million people. And I used to say over the next 5 years, but now we're down to 4 years. Time is ticking. The trajectory is good. I feel good about it. But here's the point. I've never met anyone who showed up to work and said, you know what, I really want to suck today. And yet there are plenty of people who are ineffective in their role simply because us as leaders, we don't do a great job providing that clarity, that challenge, that comfort that they have the tools, time, and training to be successful or actually care about our people. And that's why we come here every week to talk about topics that are relevant to leaders and how we can lead better. And so for me, I really look at people as whole people. If you're not good at work, you can't be great at home. And if you're not good at home, you can't be great at work. And so when we embrace that as leaders, I think we are able to create compelling companies. And in my experience, compelling companies always outperform. And so I think we have a great guest today. I'm so happy to see Nathan Adams in the crowd, although Clint, I told him we would talk fast. We'd get in as much for 30 minutes because Nathan's got to boogie out of here. But thanks for being here. Bill Holmes, the Philly super fan, the Best Places to Lead super fan. Carol Coffey, so glad you're here. Craig Beskey, one of my longest standing friends. I can't believe that he still talks to me. It is hard to imagine. Yannicka Schroetz. Yannicka, I hope your ankle is better. She just had some surgery on her ankle due to a ski, or I should say snowboarding accident, a small trip and fall accident. We'll act like it was a big error that you lost there, Yannicka. Kane, good to see you too. Brendan Nagel, thanks for being here. Now listen, we love to bring really interesting guests, and I think we have a great one today. Clint is our guest today. He's the president of NorthPoint Logistics, which is an Inc. 500 fastest growing company as well as best places to work. And so after I spoke with Clint before Thanksgiving, so it's been a while, I've been personally waiting for this episode. It's not a surprise at NorthPoint's trajectory and the culture that you have there. Give us the 2-minute introduction on how you went from the battlefield to the boardroom.
Yeah, absolutely. So I went to college in Wisconsin, dropped out of college and joined the Army at the day after September 11th, ended up in Baghdad from 2007. And when I got back from, I found my way in the logistics industry. It wasn't where I wanted to go. It wasn't where I was intending to go. It wasn't anything I had any experience in. But, it was 2009 and they agreed that every other Friday they'd send me some money. And that was a pretty good deal in 2009. So I fell into a trucking company and really found myself enjoying supply chain and enjoying logistics. Over the next several years, made my way through a number of other industries, worked in consulting, worked in finance, spent time in healthcare, and actually got connected with a friend of mine. We've been friends for 20 years. And he called me and said, do you enjoy what you do? And I said, I love what I do. And he said, well, I'm going to proceed as though he answered that question in a different way and tell you that, here's an opportunity that I know some people and would love to connect you with, and you should take that call. And I did it as a favor to him in full candor. But what I found was an organization that I fit really well with, and that I thought was the right kind of people, and the opportunity to get back to an industry supply chain that I really missed, and found my way from Dallas up to Kansas City, and that's where I am today, leading this organization. So
Love it.
yeah, that's the journey.
So I think the reason that I really loved our conversation, and we were just talking about it before we went live, was the whole notion of the frameworks that you're using to help and guide your organization, being able to create that clarity, drive decision-making down inside the organization. We know that after studying 4,000 organizations over the last 3 recessions, only 9% of companies actually expand during recessions. And one of the hallmarks of those companies is they drive decision-making down as low as possible, which means we have to be clear on our objectives and people have to have the authority and responsibility to act. And so that was the thing that struck me most during our conversation. So the 3 places that I want to take us today on this journey is really your approach to business. One is, how do you find the right people to work with? Because people are at the heart of every business. The second is, how do we make the best decisions as soon as possible? And then the third piece is, what is a relentless focus on execution and what does it look like inside of a business? So talk to me about this as we get warmed up. You were in the number 2 position
Mhm.
down in Texas.
Yep.
And you decided to move to Kansas City. You had to convince your wife to do that. I probably would have had to do the same thing. And you moved into the number one role. What
Mhm.
is the difference between being in the number two seat and the number one seat that surprised you?
That's a great question. It's something that I actually think about an awful lot. I'm still great friends with the guy that I worked for in Texas when I was in that number 2 seat, and he and I were catching up, I don't know, this is a couple of weeks ago, and I told him, like, this is the thing that I think, I underestimated, right? And really what it is the degree to which your decisions are yours. There is no it's the whole after, like, the euphemism, it's lonely at the top, and everybody says it's lonely at the top, and really lonely at the top. And I don't say that in the sense that it's sad and depressing, and it's Aaron Rodgers' weird, lock yourself in the dark for 4 days to make a decision about your career. No, I think it's lonely at the top in the sense that when you have to make a decision, you don't get to turn around and go, yeah, what should we do? Right? It is the challenge of having to own that decision. And sometimes those are tough calls, and sometimes they're not tough calls. But whether they're tough or not, you got to own them. And I had led in the military, and I had led in business, and I had been in these situations throughout my career, and I thought, yeah, I know what it's like to have to make those calls. But I think the degree to which you don't have a when you're in that number one seat, it's your call no matter what. And you really do have to own that whole decision. And sometimes that means you got to own some negative outcomes from it, right? Sometimes that means you got some unhappy people, and you've got some people who, frankly, you did wrong by, right? And you just have to own that and accept it. And you don't have another person that you can say, yeah, but I'm executing against this person's vision. So, you know, I tried as hard as I could. That's the tough part. I really think that's the most difficult part. Now, the other side of it is, when that decision is favorable, you get to be the one who gets to who gets to kind of push that credit someplace else, right? And you don't watch somebody else make that push and go, you know what, it probably should have been over here. Like, you're praising this person, and it really should be this person. You get to be the one who orchestrates, like, who gets that spotlight. And I think that's about the best thing in the world, right? Is getting to make sure that the spotlight is pointing on the right person. There's not a lot that's more gratifying than that.
I think you're right. And, it's one of the things, and Nathan Adams and I were talking about this. It is hard to explain to someone who hasn't been in the top seat making all the decisions what that pressure feels like. I mean, I can try and explain it. I can give you examples. However, once you get into that seat and you look left and you look right and you think, shit, I mean, these decisions I have to own. I have to own them from start to finish. There is a different level and gravity of responsibility that goes along with that. Because I always believed, companies that I've run, I'm not I'm not just having that person in my care. Their family is trusting in me to make good decisions, to make sure that we shepherd these organizations forward in reasonable ways.
I think the other thing too is it's less a question. Well, there's certainly a volume of decision, right? And there's certainly a level of decision, but I think the type of decision also changes. When you're in the head operations seat, you're weighing operations versus operations, right? The problems you have all live in a single type of world. When you're in charge of the revenue seat, it's all revenue thinking. When you're in charge of the finance seat, it's all finance thinking. And then you get into the number one seat and you go, hey, the priorities that are competing are no longer like priorities, right? You're not debating, do we do this or that within the same kind of set of you mentioned frameworks, right?
Mhm.
Frameworks that exist to live in a single silo don't work cross silo, or they don't work as well. And all of a sudden you have to change the way in which you think to say, listen, this is the right decision from an HR perspective, but it's a bad decision from a tech perspective. Or this is the right decision from a finance perspective, but it's really going to harm our operations. And there's no good calculator to be able to say, how do I trade off these things that don't actually intersect, right? Except for in this moment. I really underestimated, I think, when I was in the number two seat, the challenge of that type of decision. I think it is real easy to sit in the peanut gallery and go, well, this is clearly the right decision because it's my functional area and I think, we all understand that to some extent, but I've been surprised over the last couple of years, the degree to which, I mean, I knew it was going to get harder, but I didn't think it was going to get this much harder.
Yeah. I think one of the things that I've talked about with senior leadership teams, the C-suite, is, you own a functional vertical. For instance,
Mhm.
I own marketing or I own operations. And you're right, you are responsible for that functional area of the company. However, when you come to the senior leadership, we don't own just lanes, we own the whole highway.
On the
So
whole
we don't
highway.
have a marketing problem. We have a business traction problem that all of
Yeah.
us are involved in trying to tackle and solve. And I think if you can get people out of their own heads to just say, oh, well, this is my lane, I'm thinking myopically, to no, you've made it to the senior level. This is your responsibility. You own the whole highway.
Yep.
And yeah, you're going to go back and you're going to own marketing when you go back there.
Mhm.
But when we're here, we're tackling problems together. And that is a distinction that goes from the VP level to the C-suite.
Totally agree. We talk about the idea that when you're in the room, your function is not to be the emissary of those outside the room in. Your function is to be the emissary of the room to those outside, right? It's really about bringing that idea out, not bringing perspective in. And I don't mean to say we don't want the perspective in, but what I mean to say is you're in the room because you've got a great brain. You're not in the room as just a pull, right? If all you are is just hey, 53% of the staff thinks we should do this, that doesn't add value in the room, right? The value in that room comes from having really smart people who can hear those things and go, listen, I know how to weigh this stuff. And I also recognize, to your point, that, I might own marketing when I step out, but in here, I own it all. And
Right.
that's a tough thing to do. And
Yes.
it's something that is required.
So listen, I think let's dig into decision making because it's one of my
Yep.
favorite things. And when I think about the CEO, the most important skill, I would argue, is decision making. And you
Mhm.
had a really well developed approach in thinking about how you guys do it at NorthPoint. And I think about things in leadership seats. There's two key traits that we think about all the time. One is the trait of risk for reward,
Mhm.
and the other is resources on opportunities. Because, as I look at that, you give the example, it's good for HR, bad for the tech stack.
Yep.
Right? We are managing, we don't have infinite elastic resources. So we are constantly making decisions on how, what we do, applying the resources on the right opportunities, unlock that success. Tell me about your approach to meetings specifically and making better decisions faster.
Yeah. So the first thing that I will say when it comes to making better decisions faster is that the best way to make better decisions is to make fewer decisions. There's a ton of research around the idea of decision fatigue. And my favorite actual thing to illustrate this is to look at what physicians do throughout the course of their day, right? If you look at the start of their shift to the end of their shift, the rate at which they recommend surgery versus additional tests over the course of their day, they're much more likely to recommend surgery at the beginning of the day. At the end of the day, they're much more likely to recommend additional testing. And what it says is, and it's to a statistically significant level, right? This isn't, a guy does one every 9 months, but I think what it illustrates is at the beginning of the day, they're coming in, all fresh and full of vigor, and they're willing to make those decisions. And as the day goes on, the weight of those decisions and the pressure of them starts to erode their willingness to be decisive. And so the answer of, well, hey, let's order another test or let's get some more information starts to take over. And so the reason I bring this up is to say, fewer decisions is gonna mean better decisions. That's the first step. And there's a lot of ways to make better decisions, right? But one of them, and you mentioned earlier, is this idea of hiring great people. And we could talk about that separately. But the way in which we focus on making great decisions or trying to make faster decisions at least is really understanding who owns the decision. And so one of the things that we do is when we have, meetings that have a decision, first of all, when we have a meeting that has a decision, we call it out, right? When that meeting goes out, if I look at my calendar right now, there are meetings that say decision, colon, and then what's the decision that has to be made, right? That's the title of the meeting. And the value of that is everyone's showing up at the meeting oriented around the idea we've got a thing to do, right? There is something to do in this time that we have carved out. We're not just meeting to talk about topic XYZ. So we sit down for that meeting, and in the description of the meeting is already listed who's the decider and what's the question. What's the decision that has to get made, and who owns that decision? And so before we start the diving into the topic, or framing up the issue, we just ask real quick, is everybody aware of who the person who has to make this call is? And sometimes it's me, a lot of times it's me, but okay, great. We all understand that person is now on the clock. And so, we operate with this idea that, Colin Powell had said that, all good decisions come with between 40 and 70% of the information. If you make it before you've got 40, you're making it too early. If you make it, before or after you've got 70, you waited too long to get the decision made. And so this area between 40 and 70 is really the magic area where a good decision happens. The person who owns that decision, it's their call when we get between 40 and 70, and they've got enough to make the decision. And when they do, that's it. Meeting's over. The end. It's very jarring, right? The meeting I had just before we came on was scheduled to be a 60-minute meeting, and it lasted about 13 minutes. And the answer was, we knew what we needed to do. Great, that's the decision. And we're done, right? And now everybody's got 47 minutes back, which is great. But more importantly, we didn't sit there and talk around the topic for that entire time and confuse everybody. The last thing we said in the meeting was, here's what we're going to do. Everybody break, right? Now it's time to just go execute. And I think that level of immediacy of decision making, right? And that framework of being able to say, I know who owns this call, is incredibly important. When there's not that clarity around who owns the call, that's, I think, when you see people discuss topics and end up in violent agreement with each other, right? Where they're arguing back and forth for something that they've already aligned on. If you don't have that defined, it's real tough to be successful. So that's, and to be clear, like I will caveat this with, I don't think we're great at it, right? I don't think anybody's great at it. This is something where, are we good at it? Yeah. And I'll take good all day, because I don't think most people are.
How many people were in your last meeting?
I had 4.
Right. So
4.
I think about things in the C-suite by minutes. If I can save people minutes,
Yep.
then I'm winning. And so,
Yes. Yeah.
I don't know what 4 times 47 is, but I know 4 times 50 is 200. And
Yeah.
so we just gave 200 minutes back to the company to actually do things that are productive. And I think it's one of the smartest ways to think about how to come together to meet, because I say this all the time. When you put the smartest people inside a business that have the most context, the best brains, the most problem solving ability, we better be solving a problem.
Absolutely.
Otherwise, I see so many meetings on calendars just to communicate information. It's a waste of time. We should trade information asynchronously. Trust that people are going to read their email,
Yep.
give the brief, but you should always be thinking about, if we're putting the smartest people or the highest level leaders inside a room together, we better be tackling a problem, and we better be clear about what it is.
Yep.
And so I love that piece.
I think the challenge there is really, it's about thinking about opportunity cost, right? It's what else, to your point of that 200 minutes. Yeah, it's 200 minutes, but what does 200 minutes really equate to? Like, what can be done in that 200 minutes? And I think when people really start to click in on that, that's when you start to, the idea of, well, we're giving time back to people. Think about how long it takes to solve this other problem and this other problem and this other problem. We just gave all of that back. So that one meeting, yeah, we scheduled it for 60, and it took 13. But the truth is that we now allowed ourselves to have a better framing for the next one, right? That's the key. It feeds on itself.
I think you're right. I'm going to ask you, where did you learn that approach? Because it's something fairly unique. At least I haven't encountered it. Maybe I'm just not that well read, but
I think that it was the confluence of 2 things. One is consulting, and the other is the military. In a consulting capacity, you're accounting for every minute, right? That's what you have to sell as time. And so, when we would scope out a project, we would scope it out on an hours basis. And then you start to look at, okay, we have a finite number of hours, and that number is ticking down, and we don't get to go back to the client and say, hey, listen, we spent 6 hours dawdling around this silly topic. We'd like to whack your bill up another, $3,000. Are you comfortable with that? The answer is probably going to be no. So that's now our time. and we're eating that time. And so I think that part of it, that idea of thinking really mathematically about it really came from that. The other part of it, the urgency piece, absolutely came from my time in the military. That's it's a great factory for decision making because the consequences are high and there is a ticking clock. And I think there's an element of, I remember when I was in Iraq, when we would go anywhere, when we'd stop, right? The vehicles would stop and we'd get out and we'd talk to locals. Somebody's job was to keep an eye on the stopwatch, and they would call out every minute, every 2 minutes, every 3 minutes, like the way we'd go through. And the reason for that was the longer we sat on a particular location, the longer we were giving an enemy sniper the opportunity to set up and get us when we were getting back to our vehicles, right? You become acutely aware of the impact of time when the impact of time has the possibility of ending somebody's life. And so that respect for time, I think, really came from that environment. The mathematical understanding of it came later when I was able to really go, okay, nobody's getting shot at work, thank God. But
We hope not.
yeah, but there's a financial implication of it as well. And look, that's the business equivalent. So yeah.
I always loved when I encounter people who have worked at Jimmy John's, because I don't know how you can order a sandwich at the cash register and before you've paid for it, there is a sense of urgency to get that
Sense of
sandwich
urgency.
done. And
That's
I
it.
think if more people had that sense of urgency,
Yeah.
I think it'd be amazing. Steve Wilson, who used to be my national account rep at Home Depot, he used to say, I wish I could just hire people from Jimmy John's or people who have that ethos, because when you have that sense of urgency to get stuff done, it just permeates throughout the entire business. And
Yeah.
I think it's a beautiful thing.
I saw a thing where Peyton Manning was talking about, he was breaking down quarterback film, and he was talking about these quarterbacks as they're under the pass rush, and he said they've got to do a better job of hearing the clock. Like they've got to do a better job of listening to that clock in their head and understanding when to get rid of the ball. And I thought, like, that's really an interesting way to think about it, because there's no way you can teach that. There's no way that you can sit down with somebody and say, listen, I'm just going to, introduce this idea. It's a choice that person makes to be able to reframe their behavior in a way that says time matters, right?
Yes.
And we can try to influence it as much as we can, but at the end of the day, it really is the individual's choice because it's something that's going on inside their head. And I thought that's a really fabulous way of encapsulating this idea of you have to be able to hear the clock. So that's something that's always stuck with me.
Love it. Walk me through the second piece of your decision-making rubric so that you're crunching down the number of decisions that actually need to be made and how fast we do that. Walk us through that.
Sure. So very basic step-by-step process. Okay. So the first idea is, or the end goal here is to be able to steal a bunch of time from inconsequential things to spend them on consequential things. Okay. And if you can do that effectively, your decisions on the consequential things will be more thought out, and therefore you will not have to deal with the ramifications of a wrong decision in that area as often. Now, you're going to get them wrong for sure, right? I do every day, but you will have thought through the decision before you make it to the point where when you get it wrong, you can now pivot from it, right? Eisenhower said that, I found that the plan is worthless, but planning is indispensable. And that's the thinking, right? Is how do we steal from all the small to spend time on the consequential? And so the first question that you have to ask is there a is if you're deciding between two options, is one of them clearly better in the long term, right? Is there a clear benefit to one of them in the long term? And if the answer is yes, then just do that, right? Just do that. Don't think about anything else. If there is a long-term benefit, just pick that one. The sun's going to come up tomorrow, and you don't want to be in the business of trying to bet on long-term outcomes not occurring. Like that's a loser's bet long-term, right? So if one of them is clearly better long-term, do that. Okay, great. Now we've set aside some decisions. The next, like, what's remaining? We now know that the things that are remaining do not have a clear long-term, one of the long-term benefit, one of the options is not clearly better long-term, right? Okay. Is one of them clearly better short-term? If the answer is yes, do that, right? Because if it's the same long-term and one of them is going to be a short-term win, take the short-term win. Real simple, right? We've now carved out a huge chunk of decisions just by thinking through, is one of them clearly better long-term? Is one of them clearly better short-term? In that order, okay? Now we're at a position where we don't know. We don't know that one of them's better long term. We don't know one of them's better short term. Okay, there's a lot left in this bucket. So the next question is, can we reverse the decision? Is it a two-way decision? And if the answer is yes, just pick an option. Because if it's reversible, just picking an option lets us start moving, and then we can get more information, right, to shape our reaction to it. I think that the amount of time people spend on reversible decisions is really staggering. Like it really is a staggering thing. Don't do that. Just pick an option and execute. Okay, it's not reversible. This is a one-way door. Great. Let's move through the framework a little deeper, right? So now, not clearly better long-term, not clearly better short-term, not reversible. Okay. Now the question is it really important? Because if it's not important, just pick an option. Just pick an option and move on. You know, if you and I are sitting down to eat lunch, one of them's not better long-term, one of them's not better short-term. It's not reversible. We can't go back in the kitchen and yell at them to change it. But does it really matter if you get the chicken sandwich or the turkey sandwich? It doesn't. Just get the turkey and move on, right? So irreversible, right? Then important. Then the next question is, can you make a better choice with more time or effort? Because sometimes the answer is no. We just don't know. We don't know what more we can learn. Like more information doesn't necessarily make the decision better. You know, I look at this and a gambling analogy, right? Before the card falls, there's not more you can learn to understand how to bet better, right? I mean, I guess you could, have counted cards a bunch and understand that, but you can't get that in the moment. So now we get to the place where we've got decisions that are not clearly better long-term, not clearly better short-term, right? They're not reversible. They are important, and more information will make the decision better. The last question to ask is it worth creating that information, right? Or is it worth finding that information? Are you going to have to spend 10 hours of your IT guy's time or your finance analyst's time to give you a decision that's 1% better, right? If so, don't do it, right? Just pick an option and move on. But if doing that, if thinking about it more, if gathering more information actually is going to allow you to make a material difference, that's the decision to spend your time on, right? All of those decisions we just stole time from, we're going to spend on this one topic at the very end, right? And that's going to allow us to really focus our efforts to say, this is a decision that really matters. This is a decision that really, truly matters. That razor really does help whittle out a lot of decisions.
I'm amazed at how much time people spend, you said this, on decisions that don't matter, that more information isn't coming.
Yeah.
And it's one of the things that I had to get comfortable with. You're never getting to 100% information.
Nope.
You have to understand trajectory and velocity and be okay with it.
Yeah.
And I think that the piece that people miss, particularly in more junior roles, they think there's going to be some epiphany. And my encouragement to, people who are growing up through organizations, taking on more and more responsibilities, value your time as you go through making these decisions, because, there is going to be a difference. We're never going to know what it was, right? But not acting, not making a decision, to me, is a greater cost than making potentially a suboptimal decision, because at least we have the trajectory and the velocity headed in the right direction.
So are you familiar with the concept of the OODA loop?
Yes.
The observe, orient, decide, act.
Yep.
Right. John Boyd's theory around started with fighter pilots, right? So what you're talking about is somebody who can't move through that orient to decide stage fast enough. And the problem with that is that as decisions get made around them, additional information is now being added to the observe step, right? And it's resetting their loop. And my thought process, and what I've really tried to, evangelize to my team, is that our goal is not to have our loop ever interrupted. Our goal is to perpetually interrupt the other loops, right? Interrupt loops outside of ours. And the way to do that is to recognize you're not going to get it perfect, but getting it a little wrong gets you some feedback that allows you to move through that loop faster. I mentioned I was in the Army. I was an artilleryman, observed fire, right? And I was a forward observer when I was enlisted, and then I was a fire support officer when I was an officer. And one of the things that you do is you call for fire, like you learn how to do call for fire, right? Calling in artillery fire from 20 kilometers away. You don't hit the target with your first round. Like, nobody's that good. but you get rounds downrange as fast as you can, and then you adjust them, right? And you see where it lands and you make adjustments to get it to your target. But if you sit there and dither and try to figure out exactly what's perfect, you're never going to get it right, right? It's just not going to happen. The target's going to move. The weather's going to change. You got to get rounds down range and then adjust from that. And so the point is, stop making all of the decisions that are unimportant, right? Just execute against them and then spend your time on the important stuff. Spend your time figuring out the important decisions.
Before we hopped on, you were sharing inside your company. There's been a lot of noise in the economy and looking downrange on, what it is that we're doing. You had the unfortunate time to let a handful of people go inside of your company, and I've had to do that too, and it's awful. Can you walk us through what you were thinking about in that decision, how you made those decisions? Because you were making some bets. We didn't have perfect information, but you were making some bets on the economy continuing to go down a path the way it was, and that didn't work out, and you had to recalibrate and readjust.
Yep.
How did you do that?
Yeah. So the first thing that I will say is that decision-making process, I believe, is and always will be and always should be the hardest decision-making process that comes with the seat. I think the day that you wake up and it's easy for you to let somebody go, it's easy for you to have to tell somebody, it's easy for you to have the conversation with somebody that says, that there isn't a seat for you at the company anymore. You really need to walk out the door, because at that point you're not an authentic person, right? It should hurt. And I tell that to my team all the time, when we were going through the difficult process was, listen, it's not okay that it hurts. It's good that it hurts, right? This is supposed to be really hard for us. And that's tough, but that's what comes with it, right? So how did I go through that thought process? What was I thinking? I think, if you think about that decision-making rubric that I just went through, we had made some bets, and the supply chain, the transportation world largely is a first quarter, fourth quarter business. When the weather is bad, the business is good, and vice versa. And so as we were moving through the middle of last year, we had a pretty strong Q2 last year as an industry. And I think what we're seeing now is that a lot of the demand that was ordinarily Q4, Q1 demand got pushed earlier as a response to COVID. Now, at that point, the question really in the industry was, is this a result of just an elevated curve, right? We're still going to see the standard curve. It's just going to be at a higher number, or are we seeing a flattening of demand? And the idea of a flattening of demand just didn't line up for most people, right? And so we all, I think, kind of independently came to the conclusion, like, we do see the economy continuing to thrive as we get into Q3 and Q4. And then Q4 just really landed across the industry with a bit of a thud. And you can look at the publicly traded companies to see how much of a thud it really was, but it was pretty substantial. And for our company, it certainly was a challenge. Now we're still seeing an upward trajectory, which is a good thing, but it's not at the level that we thought it was going to be. And so we had made the bet in the spring and summer of last year that we were going to see that continued upward trajectory at the pace at which we forecast that we were going to. We got it wrong. I got it wrong, right? And I'll take the ownership on that, because it was me who made that call. And so when you're going back and you're looking at, hey, we got this wrong, how do we fix we talked about models and frameworks. How do we fix the economic framework of the business? That's one of the decisions that has to get made. And I think, the news is filled right now with a lot of folks in our industry that are coming to that same conclusion. But ultimately, the way that we were able to find the time as a team to have those discussions was by really walking through and thinking through the idea that these are not, this isn't an easily reversible decision, right? This isn't something that is an important decision, right? This is something where additional time and thought helps us get better at it. Okay, that's where we need to spend our time. And so that's it's certainly not fun to have to wrestle with that decision, but in terms of substantive decision making, I don't know that there's something that's of a greater importance in this role.
I know when I had to do it, man, I was gutted for weeks leading into it, and hoped and prayed, and the reality of it was that the world was changing, and we had to respond to what the world was changing to. And you do that with care and empathy and realizing, I mean, it's never lost on me. When I've walked into, to terminate someone, I know that I have more information than they do, and that I'm about to go change the trajectory of their life, and they don't know it yet.
Yeah.
And man, that is a really, really hard thing to do. And so, thank you for sharing that.
No,
Um,
absolutely. The last thing I'll say on it, I think it's there. You mentioned the idea that like people in a more junior role as they're kind of coming up in their career, they're always looking for that epiphany. And I think when it's a tough call, when it's a tough and inevitable call, right? Like once you recognize that this is the thing that must be done, it's really easy to start trying to say, okay, how do we do it perfectly? How do we do it in a way that
mhm,
doesn't hurt? How do we do it in a way that, to your point, right? It's an incredibly painful and difficult thing in that room. How do we remove that? Because I think we're hardwired, one, to try not to inflict pain on others, but two, my brother and I have talked about this, and I think the reason that everybody loves, he actually said this, the reason everybody loves apps like Waze is because we all enjoy a good optimization problem. Like we're hardwired as a species to like optimizing. And you try to optimize that situation and say, like, can we find a way? Can we engineer a way that everyone's going to be happy? And then but
mhm.
I think the value of really being disciplined and focused and understanding how to think about that decision is to recognize you're not going to. You're just not going to. And you can try as hard as you can and you can have the most empathy and you're not going to make a perfect call, but you've just got to do the right thing and lead with authenticity.
I think one
So
of the most important lessons that I had when I had to lay off 23 people was one of our employees who was about to become a former employee. Wanda Duster said, "Our jobs don't define us. Come on, everyone,
hmm,
we're going to be okay." And she single-handedly changed the tone and feeling in that room. I'm still grateful
yeah,
because that was a non-fun, really hard day. And I'm glad that Wanda brought it back home for us to remind us of what's really important. We get to go
yeah,
home to our families and love our families. And yeah, I love my careers and my vocations, but my family, my friends, and my values are the things that define me.
yeah.
Not my career.
Totally agree.
So,
Yeah.
Kane had a question for us.
Yeah.
Kane, if you want to come off mute, you can ask it yourself, or if you want to let me ask it, I can ask it for you.
Hey, yeah, my question was just if you have somebody who tends to spend time on something that's
All right. Yeah. Kane's getting broken up a little bit, so I'm going to ask it
well,
for him. He said, what do you do if someone wants to spend too much time on a decision that's reversible or unimportant? What is the coaching that you're doing there?
So I will tell you how I first got coached on it, and then I will tell you how I encourage others to coach on it. And those are not the same answer. So when I was going from being enlisted to being an officer, I went back to college and went through the ROTC program. And so I was a cadet, and I had gone through, and I was a pretty successful enlisted guy. I was pretty good at executing. And so the first is like the first semester of ROTC. They take the prior service guys, they take the enlisted guys who are going, the green to gold guys they call them, who are going from enlisted to officers, and they put them in charge at first, right? Because there's got to be somebody who knows a little bit of what's going on. And so we were out doing a training exercise, and it's like a 2-hour exercise where you get a mission and then you have to execute against it. And I got to a point where we made a call, and I had the plan, and I laid out the plan, and we were in the process of executing against it, and I just froze because things didn't go according to plan. And I didn't know what to do. And everyone was looking at me, and I had no idea how to react. And it was a situation I hadn't been in before, right? And I really truly got, it was the paralysis by analysis. And I just thought through, what do I do? What do I do? What do I do? What do I do? And the lane expired, like the time expired, and we just like, I mean, it's, as a Vikings fan, it reminded me of every poor end of game situation where we can't figure out what play to run. And so we get back and we're debriefing, and I went to one of my senior instructors and I said, this clearly isn't for me. It's not the right place for me to be. I'm just going to go back and I'm an executing guy. I'm not cut out for this. And he said, well, just sit down. Let's talk. And I said, okay. And he said, so how many choices were you debating between? And I said, I mean, there's an infinite number of choices that, one can make in this situation. And I don't think he liked that answer. And he said, no, that's not the truth. He said, how many choices were you really debating between? I said, 3. He said, okay. And if you put them on a wall and you throw a dart, what's the likelihood you're going to get the right choice? And I said, well, it's 1/3. And he said, all right. And what's the likelihood you're going to get the right choice when you're sitting there just doing nothing, drooling for 45 minutes? And I said, 0%. And he said, all right. And he slammed his hand on his desk and he said, then throw the effing dart. And I thought, okay, like that's actually pretty good advice. Right. And we talked about it a little bit more and I was terrified in the moment because, that's a bit of an intimidating moment, but there's an element of just help that person understand. And this is the way that I do it today is look, you're not going to get it right all the time. And that's okay. But nothing is always going to be the wrong choice. Right? What you're doing right now is guaranteed to be wrong. Now, you might get it wrong by making a call. You might, but you will get it wrong by not making a call. So do you want to have the possibility of a win or do you want to have a guaranteed loss? Right? Exactly. Yeah. Seeing in the chat, good decision or bad decision is better than not making one. The advantage is being able to then say, I made a decision and now I can pivot from it. The decision is not permanent, right? I think that helping people to understand the impermanence of that decision has value and being able to understand the idea that this is reversible. It's okay that we're going to get it wrong sometimes, right? Perfection is not the expectation, except for in a few areas. And when they are, those are the areas where we need to spend our time figuring out how to make the right decision.
Love that. Great feedback. Let's move over from decision making to execution.
Mhm.
Right. So, one of the frustrations that I see for CEOs is this feeling that we have to do it all or we have to oversee it all because, we don't trust our people. And a lot of times what I find is it's just that we've done a shitty job of creating clarity for people. It's not
Mhm.
that they don't know what they're doing or don't want to do a great job. I've even talked about like the swooping in syndrome, different than the shiny object syndrome, where we disempower people because we jump in, we save them, or we redirect them instead of allowing them to have the autonomy to make agile decisions that they feel empowered, in pursuit of the company's objectives. Can you break down the two ways that you think of execution and the frameworks that you use to build that clarity for your people?
Yeah, absolutely. So your point about the swooping in, couldn't agree with you more. I think that's I am good in a crisis. My background has brought me to that place, and because I'm a human being, I have a need to be wanted and a want to be needed. And so I think that it's easy for me to see myself walking through life and going, that's a crisis, that's a crisis, that's a crisis, because I know those are areas in which I can excel, and that's not the right answer. So I completely agree with you there. The way that I try to coach our team to execute on this. And again, look, are we perfect at it? No, we're not, right? It's an iterative process. And so I would certainly, I think it is important to recognize that this entire thing is really all about it's an iterative process. It's a journey. You're going to get better at it tomorrow than you are today. I'm hoping to get better at it tomorrow than I am today.
I think the thing that's important, Clint, just to note,
Yeah.
and the thing that struck me in our conversation, striking me now is it's the conscious, intentional approach of here's how we do it inside our company, and these work for you. And I think some people should adopt these models, but not having a framework, not having a model of here's how we allocate resources on
Yes.
opportunities.
Yes.
That's the mistake.
That's a mistake.
And that's how you end up with the paralysis analysis because we
Yes.
don't make better decisions faster because we have a framework to do that. We treasure execution and we'd rather
Yep.
execute than not execute. And
Yeah.
that's to me like the thing that I'm pulling out of this is
So true.
as a leader, it's your job to create the framework so that people can understand how we allocate resources on opportunities and do it as quickly as possible.
Absolutely agree. And look, the framework can change. In fact, it should change, right? The framework is not going to be right the first time. You iterate against it just the same as a decision gets iterated against. So the two frameworks that we use that I really evangelize and that we've incorporated. The first one is the idea of tight, loose, tight. Okay. And if you think about like there's three sort of processes, right? Or three buckets, right? The first one is expectations and clarity. The second one is all about execution. And the third one is accountability. Okay. And a tight, loose, tight philosophy is I'm going to define very clearly what needs to be done. I'm going to give you total and unilateral control into how it gets done. And I'm going to be very tight on accountability when it gets done. Okay. And I'll give you an example of how I've used that framework with my team today, right? That actually occurred, a few hours ago. So we have in our business, we have 8 dashboards that are up on, and I'm gesturing over here because this is where they are. We have 8 dashboards that are up on large monitors throughout our office that demonstrate the status of our business on, in 8 different areas. There's one for, our international operations. There's one for our domestic operations. We have one that's calendar based. We have one that has to do with end of month tasks that have to get completed. So things around, support functions, et cetera, et cetera. So, okay. The first thing that I provided was a very clear expectation to our tech team to say, this is exactly what I want these dashboards to demonstrate, right? I'm going to give you really clear scoping. I want them to look this way. I want them to report the information in this way, right? I want it to be graphical. I don't want it to be just a bunch of text. Okay. Now you figure out how to do it and you tell me how long it's going to take. And they gave me a date and I said, okay, great. Then we're not going to talk until that date, right? But you're going to be expected to deliver it on that date, right? Tight, loose, tight. Now that doesn't mean go sit in the room dark and I'm not going to give you any information. What it does mean is I'm not going to hover over your shoulder and say, how you doing on that? You doing good on that? Are you good? How are things going? Can I get an update? I think the value of those updates is absolute garbage. And when people say, oh, I'm 40% done on this project. No, you're not. You're absolutely not 40% done. I will bet every dollar I've ever made in my life that it's not 40%. And here's how I know. Because every time I've ever gotten an update that's a percentage based, it always ends in a 0 or a 5. I've never had somebody say, you know what, I'm 22% done, right? And it's because we're ballparking it, we're guessing it. Well, what's the value of that? The value of that is, right, the reason people ascribe value to that is because they're not loose in the middle, right? They're not willing to say, you own the middle, right? You own the execution. I've been tight on expectations. I'm going to be tight on accountability, but you own the execution. I'm going to be very loose in how we execute. Now, does loose in how we execute mean there are no guardrails? No, that's insane, right? That's madness. If my tech folks had said, great, to do this, we're going to buy a piece of software that costs $1 million a month. Okay, no, that's not loose in the middle. That's absent, right? So there's guardrails, but I expect them to really own that process. And it's not my role to put my hands on it, right? It's my role to be there as an advisor if they need it. And that really leads me to the second framework, right? And the second framework is, sorry, did you have a question before I
Yeah,
go into that?
I do.
Yeah.
I want to just pull back just a little bit on
Absolutely.
on the first piece of it, which is setting the expectations. Because I work with a lot of leaders, wonderful people.
Yeah.
Sometimes the mess, because a lot of them are visionary, is we have a really clear picture in our mind of what we want to go see happen. And what we forget to do is make the words come out of our mouth so that they can be heard, so that people can go do the execution. Do you have any tips or language or any of those pieces? Because to me, other than being able to get out of your own way and not micromanage people in the middle piece of it, and accountability to me is easy, but that's another conversation. How do you make sure that you set up people for success, that they have, like, do they have to know the who, what, when, where, how? Like, do you have anything that you're given a checklist? What is it that you do to make sure that the execution doesn't go off the rails?
Yeah. So I think it comes back. So the way in which I communicate that expectation is going to vary depending upon the item, right? It's invariably going to be very specific in some areas and very general in others, because some of the stuff I'm just not going to understand or know, or really frankly have fully thought out, right? But what I want to do is I want to make sure that we share an understanding, even if that understanding contains ambiguity, right? If there's ambiguity, it has to be mutual ambiguity. Because if it's mutual ambiguity, then we've identified an area that we have to solve problems on. If it's individual ambiguity, if they have ambiguity, but I don't, that's the problem, right? And the way to avoid that is I ask for a brief back. I just say, tell me how, like, what'd you hear, right? You now need to sell me on what my vision was. And if they start going down and I go, hold on a second, that sounds different than what we talked. Now we have to go back. right? So it really is a question of the way in which the first conversation goes is fairly free flowing, right? But then there's going to be a moment where I'm going to make sure that you know exactly, like you're going to have to tell me back, right? So that we're aligned. And then if we have that area of mutual ambiguity, I'm not really sure what's going to, using this project, right, of these dashboards, I don't know what we want on the left side of this thing yet. Give it some thought. Give me some feedback. Great. I don't know what I want on the left side of it. That's your note. Okay, fantastic. Now, at some point, I'm fully expecting you to come back and go, hey, I was thinking we could do this, right? Because we have the mutual ambiguity. But if I say, I want this, and you go, I'm not really sure I understand what that is, right? Now it's on you to ask that, but it's on me to force the opportunity for that, right? And I think that's where a lot of leaders really stub their toe is there's the assumption of understanding, and there's not a forcing of a conversation to identify misunderstanding, right? It's not the job of the, I have used this analogy before. When my wife was pregnant with our first, we went to the birthing classes, and the instructor said, you know, mom's, your job is to have the kid, and dad's, when you're in the hospital, you should be just sitting there and asking the mom, do you want a blanket? Do you need a glass of water? Do you need to move your feet? Is it too hot? Is it too cold? Are you hungry? Are you thirsty? And my wife looked over at me, and she just real calm. She said, if you ask me all those questions, I'm going to throw you the hell out of the room. If I need a blanket, I'm going to tell you I need a blanket. And I said, great. Now we're aligned. Now there's absolutely no mutual ambiguity, right? Like we understand whose responsibility it is to ask, right? But as a leader, it's our responsibility to create space for that ask, right? It's our responsibility to force that question to the table. It's not our responsibility to ask the question. It's our responsibility to force that question to the table. And so the way I do that is through the brief back, right? It's just, hey, here's what I said. Like, tell me what, like, give it back to me, right?
I think it's great. The other tactic that I've used, because even though I think this is ridiculous, because I think I'm a very nice person, but people have told me that I'm very intimidating. And I give people permission, explicit permission. If you have a question, you have 100% permission, 100% of the time to ask a question. I want you
Absolutely.
to raise your hand. My assistant, Maria, she knows you raise your hand if there's something going on. And so helping foster that culture of it's okay to ask questions because we want to get it right. I don't want you to operate in a vacuum and wonder.
No, you have to.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Give us the second one
Okay.
that you guys use.
Second framework, 10-80-10. All right. So 10-80-10 really applies in a very similar way to what we just talked about, but it's more around the middle box. Okay. It's more around this idea of actually creating. I own the first 10%. I own the first 10%. It is my responsibility to provide you, to get you from 0 to 10%. Okay. So again, I'm going to use our dashboard example. I had to draw a picture on the board to say, I want this thing in this area. It's going to talk about this, right? And to be clear, my picture in that area was a square that had like a cross in the middle of it. And the upper left said number. It wrote the word number. Like I didn't even put the number sign. I just wrote the word number. That was as far as I got. Okay. So we're talking real early 10% here. Okay. But I own that part. I have to provide that starting point. All right. You now own the middle 80. Okay. You own getting it to 90% solution. Don't come back to me and say, hey, listen, you got it from 0 to 10. Could you get it from 10 to 20? Could you get it from 20 to 30? I don't really know what to do. Could you do my work for me? Right. And you have to be very intentional about that as a leader. And you have to be very intentional about cultivating that environment for your team, because it's really easy for the individual contributor to say, well, gosh, he was really specific on the first 10%. I better go back and ask him, because that 11%, I bet he's got real specific expectations. And what's important is to convey that I actually have no expectations about the 11%. I just wrote the word number. Like, I don't know anything about the 11%. Okay. That's your job. That's where you come in. You get me from 11 to 80, or excuse me, from 11 to 90, get me that 80% from 11 to 90. Then we're going to work together on the last 10%. Right. There's going to be, this isn't something where it's like, here, this is your problem now, and I'm never going to talk about it again. This is something where it's, I trust you to get me 90% of the way there. But oh, by the way, let's come back and figure this out together. Like, I know that you're going to come back and go, hey, listen, this thing in the corner, I was thinking maybe instead of writing the word number, we should have some, yeah, we should have some stuff there. Could you have some detail around that? And then we'll figure it out. We'll tighten it up. The graph should be blue instead of orange, whatever it is, right? That last 10% is collaborative. And it's my job to force the collaboration, right? So the value of this 10-80-10 approach is that it provides the person who's doing the majority of the work. They're never starting with a blank piece of paper, right? And if you've ever tried to write anything, the worst thing in the world is a blank piece of paper. I tell people all the time, if you're starting to write something, actually just open up a document that you've been working on and just change what you're talking about and just start from there. At least you got words on the page. You can copy and paste it later, right? But you don't start with a blank piece of paper because that sucks. Getting the first 10% takes away that fear of the blank piece of paper. It also takes away the fear of it has to be perfect before I bring it back, right? You made the point of like asking people to ask questions. One of the best ways to ask people to ask questions that I've found, one of the best ways to encourage it is to say, I don't want to see a product at 100%. I don't. I want to see a product at 90%. You better have questions because then we're going to sand the edges and make it perfect at the end, right? I don't expect that it's great. I don't expect that it's perfect right off the bat.
Yeah,
So
and I think
that 10-80-10 works for us.
and I think it's brilliant because I think the frustration of every leader is that people don't go FSO. They don't go figure stuff out.
Yep.
They keep on cycling back to like, well, what do you think about this? What do you think about this? And then that turns into, hey, you got a second, Clint? You got a second, Bill? You got a second, Ash? And now it's like, oh my gosh, now all my time is taken up by people that should be doing their own work. Like, if you need me to do it and for me to make all the decisions, you probably don't need to be here, is
Right.
the reality of it.
Yep.
And so I would rather people make mistakes and move the ball down the field
Yes.
than to constantly re-engage me. Go try and figure it out. Go struggle. But if you truly get stuck, great, make a note. And I want you to come back and say, I thought about this. Here are my options. I think we can go this way, or this way. Here are the pros and cons of all of them. It's like, okay, great. Now you have what I call a second stage idea. I'm great at second stage ideas.
Yeah.
I need other people to do the heavy lifting and then get me to the place where it's like, okay, we need to tweak here, here, and here, because this is how it fits in the context of the business. And that works really, really well.
I think the other part that's really interesting about this is if you mentioned this idea of kind of the swooping in, right? And that swooping in, I believe happens after 10%. I believe that swooping in is when you come in at something that's at 30% and you come in and go, you know what? Listen, let me get it from 30 to 35. Right. And that creates that learned victimhood for the individual to say, oh man, I'm stuck at 52. I guess I better go ask because last time that was how I solved it. Right. Jerry knew exactly what needed to happen to get from 10 to get from 30 to 40. Right. He's going to know what to get from 52 to 55. And they don't think about, this is my thing to create. I got to own it all the way from 10 up to 80 or 10 up to 90, excuse me. Like I got to own that middle 80%. That ownership, I believe comes from being able to say, this is what I want. I'm going to give you, it's not a blank piece of paper. Bring it back to me and we'll finish it. And that level of trust that it can create in the individual, I think is incredibly transformative.
That's right, because you level everyone up inside the organization to do great work. It's pushing, the objectives and the decision making and the authority down. And we talked a little bit about this, right? The outcomes of this is there's ownership in the individual. There's mechanisms that we can refine. Things are always in motion that we can do that. And there's a clear understanding of how I contribute to the organization. One of my personal goals is that all the companies that I get to work with, that all of their people go home every night when their spouse says, hey, Clint, did you have a good day? That they're able to clearly articulate, I had a great day because I did X, Y, and Z, and that's how I contribute to the organization. I don't want people going home and not knowing whether they're contributing, because you will have, like, we wonder, like, why are people disengaged? They don't know how they're helping the team win.
Right.
Like, it's our fault. That's what I always come back to. We can do
Yep.
this thing better. And
Yes.
so you have been an amazing guest. Zach
Thank you.
Mitchell just said it on the way out. He's been to a number of these. He said best guest so far that he has seen. And I appreciate you coming and sharing your frameworks. Clint, if people want to find more of your wisdom, connect with you, what's the best way to do that?
Sure. Best way is through LinkedIn. Just connect with me there, and I check that mailbox pretty regularly.
Love it. And that's how
Yeah.
we connected,
That is how we connected. Absolutely.
which is
Yeah.
which is amazing. All right,
Yeah.
friends, we ran a little bit long, but Clint, in my opinion, you were worth it. So
Thank
thanks
you.
for thanks for hanging in here. Listen, I say this all the time. I'm not good at asking for help. I'm like the guy that plows forward. So I have to ask for help. I am on a mission to positively impact 5 million people. I got 4 years left to go do it. And so if you can help me by liking, subscribing, the content that we put out, the podcast, we have great content over on YouTube where we've taken all these beautiful golden nuggets of information and shrunk them down into playlists for you about communication, decision making, culture, all of those things. I'd invite you to go visit there, and I would sincerely appreciate it. Next week, we have Brendan. I'm going to butcher his last name, Kusamari, and Brendan's going to talk about, he's a communication expert. He is one of the most polished young people I have ever met in my life. And he's going to teach us talking about communication, because communication is one of those skills as a leader. If you are not good at communicating, you are not going to be able to take the next levels and steps in your career. And so I invite you next week to come visit with Brendan. And he has a couple of things that he's going to make you think about to create some mental agility for your communication skills. It should be a fun session with him. Other than that, friends, happy Thursday, and we'll see you again next week.